Welcome to the first energy policy seminar of this fall semester. I am Henry Lee. I am the director of the Environment and Natural Resource Program at the Belfer Center, one of the sponsors of this series, along with the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government and the Harvard University Center for the Environment. This year, we are going to focus on a theme, and that theme is the transition from a fossil fuel intensive economy to a decarbonized economy. And our first speaker is absolutely stellar individual to start a series on this issue. Let me open with a few reminders regarding the logistics of our online seminar. We are recording this seminar and we'll post it on the seminar series webpage. So if you have a friend or a colleague who misses this talk, please let them know that they can watch it later on the webpage. We have also put registration links for the next few semesters on that page. One more note, we will take questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. Please click on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type your questions. At the end of our presentation, our moderator, Professor William Clark, will take the questions and pose them to our speaker. It's my pleasure to now introduce our faculty moderator for today's seminar, Professor William Clark. Bill?
Thank you very much, Henry. I'm delighted to be here and delighted that the seminar this year is focusing on this extraordinarily important theme of transitions. I mean, those of us in the sustainability or environmental change business have known back for 30 years. You can find the notion of transitions, that is really systems level changes in how we meet basic needs for energy or housing or agriculture, food and agriculture. Not just tinkering at the edges, but transforming the structure and power politics and technologies of the systems. You can see us talking about the need for that, as I say, going back for a generation. The exciting thing, I think one of the most important developments of the last 10 years has been adding to that sort of intuitive feel that transitions were needed, the beginnings of an empirically and theoretically grounded framework for thinking about what might facilitate or impede transitions, what are the points of intervention, what are the various interacting pieces that make some of them fail and some of them don't. And at the center of that important revolution has been Frank Geels, currently Professor of Systems Innovation and Sustainability at the University of Manchester, but somebody who, starting in a series of dense historical reconstructions of how transitions in everything from sailing ships to waste disposal and now to energy systems have happened over periods of decades to centuries across multiple nations, and then subsequently to that beginning to build the theoretical framework associated with the idea of a multi-level perspective that he'll go on today. So I could not imagine a better person to be kicking off the seminar for us than Frank, and I'm delighted he's here to speak with us. Frank, on understanding and shaping the dynamics of low carbon transitions. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Bill and Henry, for your kind words in introduction and the opportunity to speak in this distinguished seminar. I'll share my screen with you guys. So yeah, I'll be talking about the dynamics of low carbon transitions from a particular perspective, which is the socio-technical transitions perspective. Because of course there is a long-standing and a huge community of particularly engineers and modelers who have looked and are still looking at low carbon transitions. I'm also a lead author of the IPCC, and of course the modelers, the integrated assessment models, are very prominent there as well. But they look mostly at the techno-economic dimensions, the technologies, and then it's just about costs and carbon pricing. Whereas the community I'm coming from, innovation studies, evolutionary economics, institutional theory, political science, looks a bit more also at the social dynamics that are part of that. So I'm not setting them up as antagonies, but they do emphasize different kind of processes. So I'll be speaking about this from a socio-technical transitions perspective. I've got a brief introduction, then talk about this multi-level perspective, which draws on evolutionary economics and Schumpeter's work on waves of destruction. And then in discussion with Bill, I've decided to focus a little bit more zooming in on the particular kind of struggles and mechanisms in different phases of transitions, emergence, diffusion, and disruption. And then I'll end with some concluding remarks. So as Bill said, it's now well known, has been for some time, that deep decarbonization requires transition to new systems. It's not only about technologies. Technologies remain important, but it's now really about system transitions, which was very prominently emphasized in the IPCC 1.5 degree report, system transitions in energy, transport, food, housing, industry, because only those kind of transitions will get you to a factor of 10 or maybe even to net zero, although that will be quite a challenge. How do I think about systems? I see them from an innovation perspective, a sociology of innovation. They're broader than they include sectors and industries, but they are broader. So if we look at, this is an example of the socio-technical system in transportation, which in most Western countries is dominated by the car, which is about 80 or 85% of passenger kilometers in most Western countries. But the car can only function because there's a fuel infrastructure. We've embedded the car in our lifestyle and mobility patterns, how we've organized cities, shopping, commuting, bringing our children to school. There's still a very big and powerful industry structure, the car companies, which still are powerful and important in terms of jobs, GDP growth. Then there's a maintenance network. If your car breaks down, you can go to a mechanic who knows about internal combustion engines. Rules and regulations of all sorts, a road infrastructure, obviously huge investments since the Second World War in particular in road infrastructures, highway systems. And the car is also stabilized by cultural and symbolic meanings, which if you go back to the early days of the car was about freedom, excitement, individuality, and these connotations are still important in stabilizing the car mobility system. So it's precisely the clustering of all these elements together which make it really difficult to change from one system to another. Although the transport system is an interesting case because that change is now beginning to happen towards electric vehicles. So that's just, I have a slightly different view of systems than some engineers. This also has social, political, cultural, and business dimensions associated with the technology. Of course, you can then also zoom in a bit more at the particular actors behind them. In the literature, this is called an organizational field. This picture is schematic. Of course, the precise configuration is slightly different in food than it is in heating, than it is in mobility and electricity, but these are some of the most important groups. Companies in industry in the middle, users who buy the products, embed them in their lifestyles, have their own user practices, supply chains, societal groups, which can be Greenpeace, but can also be industry associations, various levels of policymakers, research, and it's the whole cluster of groups that have different interests. They've got different capabilities, skills, resources. So in a way, they're playing games. They make moves and counter moves, and they respond to each other. And this is what this is what I've studied over time. You see the game being played out between the companies and the policymakers, users as well. I've studied, as Bill said, a lot of historical examples. I'm just flagging up these examples to ground it a little bit more, the kind of what I mean with transitions. I looked at the transition from sailing ships to steamships in the 19th century, also from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, from 1870 to 1930, from propeller aircraft to jetliners, from cesspools to sewer systems, from pumps to piped water systems. I also tried to do a case study with a more cultural dimension. I looked at the music industry and the shift from crooner music to rock and roll, farming as well. These are just some examples to ground it. So from this, we can derive some phenomenological characteristics. They're all longitudinal processes. This is one thing to remember. Transitions do not happen within a short period. It's not just 5 years, it's 30 to 50 years or even longer in some cases. So you really need to also divide it up into different phases. It makes no sense to talk about the transition just as one phase. They're all non-linear. They start slow with small experimentation and sheltered niches, which are then followed by acceleration. I'll come back to that later. Most transitions have unintended consequences that were not foreseen from the start. Most of them are not just smooth diffusion curves, with technologies entering markets. Most of them have got struggles involved, setbacks, twists and turns. And very often there's also exogenous shocks and pressures which really change the selection environment. So wars, oil price increases, demographic shocks. They're also they're endogenously enacted transformation processes. So actors do not stay the same in 30 to 40, 50-year processes. Actors change their interests, their interpretations, their identities. The relations between them change over time. So it's not like they're fixed, that they're given with what their interests are. They learn and they navigate the transition. And importantly, all transitions are also contested. There's always obviously incumbent firms or companies or actors with vested interests, and then there are new entrants emerging, and they may lead to overthrow. There's contestation about what is the best transition pathway, what are the best policy instruments, and all these conflicts, particularly now with low carbon, are being played out very strongly. What is the best pathway in heating, in electricity, in mobility? There's multiple ones with different pros and cons. So those are some of the general characteristics. So how can we conceptualize the dynamics related to those? The framework that I and others have developed draws quite strongly from evolutionary economics, particularly the work from Schumpeter, who had this idea of waves of destruction, creative destruction, he called it. They make a distinction between incremental innovation, which is always going on, and between radical innovation, which is what's much more rare. And these innovations emerge in niches and then take a long time to break through, and they may overthrow the existing system. That's the basic idea. I'll come back to that. Institutional theory is important because there are existing rules, institutions, and the power struggles behind them. And the rules and institutions always change in transitions. So they're inevitably also about conflict. And I also draw on the sociology of innovation, which suggests that innovation is not only about research and development in laboratories, but it's also about actors, interpretation, social networks, the coalitions, and how these change over time, particularly also when technologies move out of the lab into the market and then also into the wider society, where they have all kind of effects. So to think about transitions, we've developed this multi-level perspective. The main interest is in the meso level here. That's the existing system or regime, which is stabilized and locked in with vested interest and all kind of actors associated with them. Then there are the radical innovations that emerge in sheltered niches. So this is a typical idea from evolutionary, even from evolutionary biology, that the new species emerge in peripheral niches. That's where they develop, where they overcome their teething problems, and then gradually they may diffuse into mainstream markets and start to struggle with the existing system. And since we're interested in 30 to 50-year processes, we've also included a broader landscape to accommodate that, society or politics or economics does not stay the same. If you look at these long-term processes, there will be geopolitics, there will be macroeconomics, there will be cultural changes, demographic changes, and of course these play out in transitions as well. On the positive side, talking about low carbon and more generally sustainability transitions, there are lots of innovations have emerged in the last 10, 20 years. So in the mobility system, the food system, the energy system, we have all these innovations, but most of them are still relatively small. Although luckily now, compared to 5 years ago, some of them are beginning to diffuse. In the mobility system, of course, we've got electric vehicles, which are now beginning to diffuse, hydrogen trucks, but you also have grassroots innovations, modal shifts, teleworking, which are more about social innovations, car sharing, mobility services, and infrastructural innovations are light rail, compact cities. In the energy domain, we've got wind, solar, heat pumps, energy storage, but also more social innovations, community energy or prosumers. And we got more infrastructural innovations like district heating, smart grids, all these kind of innovations. So the positive story now, and I think also in the IPCC, that's interesting now in AR6, which is being written as we speak, compared to AR 5-7 years ago, things are now beginning to happen, particularly in electric vehicles, wind, solar, they are now really beginning to diffuse. So the interest in transitions also in the IPCC report is really increasing, and these transitions are now happening. So it's really interesting and a good time to study what's going on. So a bit more on this multi-level perspective to elaborate it a little bit further. So the meso level, the existing system, the main problem of transitions is not just the innovation, but it's actually that the existing system is so stable and it's so locked in or path dependent in the literature. Many of these systems we have now have been built up after the Second World War, or at least expanded substantially after the Second World War, and they are stabilized through different kind of mechanisms. Economic mechanisms include scale advantages and low cost. So the petrol car is really cheap compared to the electric vehicle. There's all kind of sunk investments in skills, factories, and infrastructure. Then there's also social and organizational lock-in mechanisms. So the incumbent companies have got vested interests. They've got core capabilities. They don't really like to change. They want to stay with the status quo and just incrementally improve the existing products. But also there's alignment between social groups and social capital, and us users. Lifestyles are important because we have embedded the various technologies, whether or not these are gas boilers or vehicles or the way we've built our houses, that we've embedded those in our lifestyles. So it's also a question about, do we want to change our user practices and lifestyles? And then thirdly, the problem is about politics and power. Since we are talking about these vested interests, it's definitely not an even playing field. This is in Europe, but I would argue even in the US, even more so, that the vested interests have really woken up now in the last 5 years to the threat of low carbon transitions, and they're really opposing policy change, and we see power struggles happening across the whole spectrum. So this is all well known from the literature. There's a range of reasons why change does not happen. But of course, I've shown you these historical examples. We do know that occasionally large-scale transitions do happen. So that brings me to the idea of radical innovation and niches and where this comes from. And this is not only about R&D and having good ideas. No, that's part of it. Joel Mokyr, a historian of technology, coined this really nice phrase, hopeful monstrosities. And he showed that all radical innovations emerge as hopeful monstrosities, by which he meant they're hopeful, that they, in the sense they can do something new that the existing technology cannot do, but they're also monstrous initially in their performance, which is very low and very costly. So the first computers, as we know, they were the size of half a classroom. The first cars could not go very fast, they were breaking down very frequently. I've looked at jet engines, I've looked at the internet. All these innovations initially don't perform very well, which means they cannot immediately compete on mainstream markets against these existing technologies, which are cheap and have benefited from learning economies over decades. And that's why these radical innovations often, or almost always, emerge in small peripheral niches on the outside, on the periphery of an existing system, which is here indicated with this picture. They cannot compete between T1 and T2. So during that period, they need to be carried by entrepreneurs, outsiders, small networks. Often the army has been an important initial niche, for jet engines, for the internet, to pioneer, to allow the radical innovations to emerge and to overcome their teething problems. These are just some examples from a paper by Clark et al. In 1981. They show that this period between invention, so that's the initial ideas, and innovation, which is the actual real market introduction, in many cases is several decades. There are exceptions, like the computer, which was developed from invention to innovation in only 4 years, which is partly, of course, to a large degree due to the Second World War, when this was developed and governments throwing lots of money at this. But other examples, float class, jet engine, helicopter, tape recording, they all took a very long time. And if we look at the low carbon innovation, we see the same. Electric vehicles, solar, wind, they were all developed decades ago. And they have now matured to a stage where they are beginning to diffuse into the market. But of course, we still have many other low carbon innovations in steel and plastics and aviation, which are in much earlier stages. So this way of looking at it is still relevant. Then the third level is, as I said, there's this, what we call a landscape. It doesn't really matter what term you use, but just to accommodate something that there is an exogenous context, which does not stay the same over a 30 to 40 year period. There may be slow changing secular trends like demographics, macroeconomics, ideology, geopolitics, or now climate change. And sometimes we have shocks, oil shocks, recessions, wars, and now, of course, the pandemic, where the effects of the pandemic on the low carbon transition are still to be studied. So if you put these three levels together, I've developed this sort of more dynamic schematic representation of showing how transitions develop over time. It's got different phases. So in the first phase, you see these small radical innovations emerging in small niches on the left bottom end corner. Lots of uncertainty, fluidity, trial and error, failure, exits. That's in the bottom corner. And these small niches are often invisible even for the existing regime players, which is quite stable and locked in the middle level with the stable arrows more or less showing that this is incremental change leading to particular trajectories. In the second phase, we see that the radical innovation is beginning to stabilize. You see a dominant design emerging. There's more agreement about what is the best technical way forward. There's more investment, there's more confidence, the visions are stabilizing, the networks are becoming stronger, but still that innovation is struggling against the existing system. So in the third phase, which is where the diffusion happens, that usually involves also an external shock, where the external shock opens up the existing system, leading to all kinds of tensions and windows of opportunity. And if then at the same time, this radical innovation is beginning to improve in cost, and in performance, and there is a lot of agreement about how to go forward, then this transition can happen when these multiple things come together. So this does mean that transitions inevitably are about struggles between the emerging niche innovations in the existing regime. On the business dimension, we very often have the struggles between new companies and the existing companies. On the economic dimension, there's the struggle between the gray technologies and the green ones. And as I said, this is often not an even playing field. The existing technologies, also the carbon intensive, of course, are still benefiting from huge subsidies. On the political dimension, we see struggles between the incumbent elites, which is often the politicians and the big firms, versus the entrepreneurs, the innovators, the cities, the social movements. And then we also see cultural struggles being played out in the media between either neoliberal discourse, which is, it's all about market failure and let's do a carbon tax, versus more the sustainability transition and the whole literature on planetary boundaries. And the framing of the problem does have implications for the kind of policy instruments that you will choose. So that's just a small, short description of the big picture view, and I've shown the various phases with all the different case studies and how they played out, and I try to differentiate different kind of patterns within it. But I'll now zoom in a little bit further on each of the three phases. I'm narrowing it down to three phases, and say a little bit more about some of the main processes in each phase. So I'll talk about emergence, diffusion, and then particularly about disruption. So if you zoom in a little bit further about where radical innovations come from, and you follow the entrepreneurs who start with initial ideas, they all start locally at a local level. Entrepreneurs try something on the ground. They don't know each other very well. They gradually they meet each other at workshops, at conferences. They start building these networks. They start comparing their experiences in the various local projects. They begin to generalize more aggregate lessons from the particular projects. This is knowledge circulation, aggregation, standardization. So you can actually, it's a more socio-cognitive perspective on knowledge, how you look at the knowledge sharing, how the social networks are being built, and how particular knowledge is being stabilized through standardization. I'll skip this one for the sake of time. Another important mechanism is about visions. So visions, all entrepreneurs make these visions, they make these fantastic promises in the beginning, invest in my innovation and all good things will follow. And this plays a productive role, visions, but it also leads to hype disappointment cycles, where the initial entrepreneurs overpromise about what an innovation may deliver. This then leads to a peak of inflated expectations a few years later. So when then the technology does not deliver quick enough, you see a trough of disillusionment. And then the hope is that not everyone will get so disillusioned by this pattern that they will still invest in it and improve the technology further. So we've shown this over time with the various innovations in transport. If you look at the 1990s, there was an initial really high hope on battery electric vehicles. General Motors invested in this. There was the whole California zero emissions mandate. There was a real expectation that it would break through. This did not materialize. This was then a few years later followed by high expectations about the fuel cell. And you may remember Bush promising that we were moving away from oil and we were going to go to the hydrogen economy. Billions of dollars were invested in the hydrogen economy, but that then too did not deliver. There was a hype cycle in the early 2000s about biofuels, that this was the way forward. Lots of investments also because this benefited farmers in the US. But this also did not materialize sufficiently. Then we get the new emergence of electric vehicles, initially driven by Toyota in the late 90s. They still brought that into the US. Then the Toyota Prius really diffused battery electric vehicles on its slipstream developed. And this is now, I made this picture in the early 2010s when I was still uncertain whether or not the battery electric vehicles would this time make it, knowing that there have been various hype disappointment cycles. But I think we can now say battery electric vehicles are widely seen as the way forward in transport. You can, of course, now wonder, there are several other hypes emerging. There's a big discourse about self-driving cars. I think this is already beginning to deflate. I mean, there were lots of promises about 2015 that by now we would have all these self-driving cars on the road. And of course, we do see lots of experiments, but also failures. And it's definitely not been diffusing as widely as was promised initially. Smart meters and smart homes, there were lots of hypes and promises about how this would transform our houses and how this would lead to energy saving by consumers because they would be more aware of how much energy they used. Hydrogen, of course, is the new big topic that's widely being discussed. We have had earlier hydrogen discussions, as I showed in the 90s and the early 2000s. So we still need to wait and see how it's going to pan out this time. Then importantly, the second phase is diffusion. And of course, to address climate change, this is now really what we need. I showed you, we have various low carbon innovations around. The problem is now really how to diffuse them, to get them into markets and to get them into society. And it's important to realize this is a complicated process with multiple drivers, which are economic, social, political, and business. So obviously, price and performance improvements are really important. And the good thing now, what we see with solar and wind turbines, where prices have decreased by 80 to 90% in the last 10 years, and we see the same happening with battery costs, that is really driving the diffusion of solar, wind, and electric vehicles. Interestingly, none of these improvements were foreseen by the modelers because they do not accommodate sufficiently scale economies, learning by doing, all these positive feedbacks in their models. So clearly, price performance improvements is an important driver of diffusion. When the costs go down, you see more adoption. This then in turn leads to more positive discourses. People talk about it. It becomes all, that then shapes consumer demand. When there are more adopters, you see more companies investing in this. So with electric vehicles, we now really see an innovation race where this, in the last 5 years, all the big car companies are now seriously reorienting towards low carbon electric vehicles. As these companies become bigger, they become stronger in their support coalitions, their political lobbies. They start lobbying for more adjustments, which we then also see, purchase subsidies, the tightening of CO2 emission standards, both in Europe and the United States. And in many countries now also the phase-out bans of petrol and diesel cars in Europe by 2030. It's really the combination of all these elements which drives innovation, diffusion forward. That's what this picture tries to show. So as I said earlier, we wrote a report in 2019 on accelerating low carbon transitions, and we made this graph, which the good thing now in the last 5 years is that we do see transitions. It's not just a discourse anymore. We do see them beginning to happen. They're furthest advanced in the electricity sector, the power generation sector. They're beginning to diffuse in the mobility sector, where electric vehicles. In the UK, they're now 10%. I think globally also between 8 and 10%. Of course, Norway is the leading country, 50% of all sales. The fleet, of course, is lagging behind because the replacement dynamic takes a bit longer. In buildings, it's a lot lagging behind, but then there's a whole range of other sectors which are equally important to get to net zero, where the dynamics are in much earlier phases. So trucks, agriculture, aviation, shipping, steel, cement. There are innovations there, but they're much earlier in the whole innovation transition cycle.
Frank, about 5 minutes.
Yeah, good. Diffusion is not just about a technology or a product diffusing into a homogeneous market. We tend to see it as a journey through different market segments, where you start small, then another market niche, and then the bigger market, the mainstream markets. So this is a nice example I did from Steamships, where the initial experiments with steamboats were in the 1880s, 1890s, but those technologies did not work very well. Then the steamboats were used as tugs in harbors actually to help the sailing ships maneuver. They were used on inland waterways, canals. Then they started to be used by the Navy, actually in the colonies as anti-pirate ships. Subsidized mail transport, that was the first time they were actually used to steam between Europe and the United States, but it was very expensive. But mail was something that people were willing to pay more for. And it was not until they constructed the Suez Canal that freight steamers were also used in freight transport. I don't have a lot of time to go through this in detail, but it shows you it's not just simply a technology entering a market. It usually goes through different kind of application niches. For the diffusion, it's not only about the endogenous dynamics, which I just showed in the previous 2 points. With low carbon transitions in particular, we also need to study and acknowledge the resistance and fight back from incumbent companies. This is the coal companies, oil, agri-food, utilities, cars. They have many vested interests in the status quo, in their factories, their capabilities, the infrastructures. So there's all kind of ways in which they are fighting back, funding climate denial campaigns, donations to political parties, lobbying, and shifting the discourse from climate change threat to the costs. And they're quite effective, of course. In many countries, they have been successful in slowing down all kind of policies. Policymakers can accelerate diffusion, and we say it needs to follow a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, you need to increase the selection pressure on the regime. So that you can do through taxes or regulations, which really increase the pressure on the existing one. And that's well known by the modelers as well, but they don't pay enough attention, I think, to stimulating innovation. And innovation can be done through purchase subsidies. This is about creating the markets, the purchase subsidies, price setting, public procurement, but also helping companies invest through capital grants, loans, performance standards, and of course, governments can invest in public infrastructure. It's easier said than done, these kind of innovation, these kind of policies. And I think what's quite worrying now is the huge gap that we see between what policymakers say. You know, all 130 countries have signed up to net zero, but there's a huge gap. Almost none of these countries has a realistic implementation plan. So I think that's quite worrying. That it's nice that they all sign up to the net zero goal, but they're not really doing enough to follow up. And as I just mentioned earlier, there's loads of setbacks and reversals of all kind of policies, which I've mentioned here below. CCS being scrapped, slashing renewable support in the UK, weakening feed-in tariffs, scrapping of carbon tax. And if you look at investments as well, it's been going up positively since the mid-2000s, but since about the mid-2010s, funding for renewable energy has not gone up massively. Of course, you can buy more because the costs have come down, but this does not look like a story of great acceleration where policymakers are investing a lot more. So I still characterize it as dithering and not enough. You know, it's nice to sign up to a goal by 2050, but I don't yet see enough policy implementation to reach those. Okay, then I've got 2 more slides. The third phase is about disruption. This is an important slide because this actually shows that some of these transitions are beginning to happen. This is about Germany, the German electricity transition, where you see some of the existing technologies, nuclear and hard coal, are going down, and the renewables, which is the orange line, going up. This transition has happened. Of course, it started in the 1990s and it accelerated in the 2011 after the Fukushima accident. Unfortunately, this did lead to a decline of income for the big utilities. The big 4 utilities, their income declined, their market shares declined by 75%, which really worried the policymakers. So a bit like the banks, they were seen as too big to fail. So even though this is a success case, because of this problems for the incumbents, policymakers have since the mid-2010s tried to slow down the energy transition, and they're trying to help support the incumbents reorient and deal with this. So that does show the importance of just transitions and what do you do with workers and big companies and regions that will be affected by these transitions. And then my last point, Bill, is I have spoken mostly so far about singular innovations, you know, electric vehicles and wind. I do think the big thing that we also need to look at, and people are increasingly looking at this, is not just that single innovation, but how multiple innovations together can transform an entire transport system. So for transport, this can be about, it's not only about green cars, you know, electric vehicles, it's also about fuel infrastructure and recharging. It's about new business models, such as car sharing, carpooling, Uber. But probably also need a modal shift to more public transport, maybe the revamping of local transport systems, smart ticketing, dynamic traffic management. It's the idea is that it's not transitions do not come about through a single innovation, but it's about multiple innovations coming together, as well as adjustments in the consumer practices and in the policies. Last slide. So on the conceptual level, there is a big picture heuristic kind of framework. You know, I agree, it's not a model. It's not like everything is clear cut in terms of equations, but it is a big picture framework which is widely used in the literature for making sense of what's happening in these transitions, what are the phases, what are some of the struggles. It is intrinsically interdisciplinary, which is challenging, of course, for us academics. You need to know about the technology, as well as about the business, the politics, consumption, and civil society dimension. Empirically, I've shown there are many low carbon innovations. They are existing, they are diffusing, they're getting stronger, but they're also still struggling against these deeply entrenched system. There is now finally some progress in the power sector, mostly followed by transport. But of course, there's far less progress in heating, agri-food, and industry. And these are some of the big, you know, they're hard to decarbonize, but these are some of the big sectors that we need to address next. Some of the future topics, acceleration, we need to know more about. Managing decline is important. What do we do with losers? Whole system reconfiguration, which also means looking at knock-on effects, innovation cascades, politics and power struggles. Also the question, are incumbent firms always the inert dinosaurs, or can they actually reorient? Can they become a positive part of the story? And the last thing for future research is governance, and particularly issues around policy mix and polycentric governance. Sorry, I ran over a little bit. I'll leave it at this. Thank you very much.
So thanks very much, Frank. That was a tour de force of an immensely rich and complex now set of bringing together the empirics and the theory. So let me once again emphasize Henry's invitation to everybody to put your questions you'd like Frank to address up on the question list. I'll try to be sorting them as we go into some that are clustered with one another, but we'll stay open to new ones coming on. So Frank, I'm going to, in the questions that have come up so far, I'm going to use your initial phases, organization, emergence, diffusion, and then disruption or establishment. And I thought there was one particularly interesting question from Malhorta, which was about, in the emergence stage, the role of peripheral regions. You've talked about niches in the sense of hidden little sectors or garages. But what he asks is, what are your thoughts on how peripheral regions can engage in these transitions, especially in terms of creating broad capabilities and landscape conditions that would provide fertile grounds for niche generation? I'll just add to that, niche generation that then eventually in the history of the transition ends up being picked up, not just in the periphery, but in the core. Does your historical work illuminate that question? Does the theory illuminate it?
Yeah, no, well, it's a little bit. I mean, it's a big issue, the whole geography of transitions. In the transition from sailing ships to steamships, there was a huge shift because the wooden sailing ships were made in and around the London area, whereas the iron steamships were initially made in the northern parts, the Manchester, the Liverpool kind of area. So this was a peripheral region initially, you know, where the Industrial Revolution began. So there was a huge geographical shift from the London area to the Manchester area. I think more generally, it's a big question and a big puzzle. And it really varies for different kind of sectors. In the UK, you know, many of the big industries, chemicals and steel, they're all in the peripheral regions. So that's why this whole thing about what do we do with the losers is particularly salient. These are already regions where there's not a lot of jobs, already problematic with declining industries, have been declining for decades. If they would also lose their steel industry or their chemicals industry, this would create huge regional inequalities and problems. On the positive side, this is also maybe where they can do the offshore wind turbines, and where they can start making, you know, these big things and transporting them into the sea. But this requires a huge retraining of employees, reorganizing of companies. The government is giving a trickle of money, but it's not a lot. So there is a risk that the regions become more marginalized. And in some sectors, there are some opportunities that they may gain. And it's a deeply political question as well, because in the UK in particular, everything is centered in around London. The regions have been marginalized for decades, and it may well be a risk that they continue to be marginalized. So yeah, it's a good question. There are opportunities, but I think that's where the politics really comes in very strongly.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll add simply from the perspective of an evolutionary biologist once upon a time. There, of course, our story is that a huge number of the disruptive transitions originated out of precisely peripheral areas. That is, it was finally when an innovation or a style of living that had matured in one part of the earth but not been connected to the other made the connection through transport, through colonization, and so on. Often those were really quite disastrous for many of the incumbent species and so forth, but that's the history of things. And I think the question there, coming back to Mr. Malhorta's question, is whether globalization of economies, of knowledge systems, and so on, is turning us into not having peripheries or peripheral regions. So we can leave that for a setting, because I then got a cluster on your second set of diffusion. People interested in a whole set of factors that might matter in either encouraging or discouraging it. And we got from Thomas Lee a question particularly focused on the role of the impact or significance of labor existing and skilled in the original areas. And you've spoken about that a little in terms of those being losers and what might we deal with them. But I think if I can gloss his question a little, it's to what extent does the ability to get rapid diffusion depend on workers being able to transform one set of skills and processes and so on to another, or do we have to invent whole new labor forces? That I'll put in the broader context of comments by Alicia Harley, asking for you to illuminate a little bit more on the capacity of actors in government, but also in others to promote these transitions. What is it that gives some groups of actors the ability to be particularly helpful in moving these things along? Who needs to have capacity? What kind of capacity is there?
Yeah, they're both, but they're two slightly different questions, but they're both very good. Yeah, the skills issue first. I think that's a big problem. I do think, it also varies for different sectors. So I've just been finishing a book on the UK comparing heating, electricity, and mobility. In heating, the big problem is we have a country that's 85% dependent on gas boilers. So we've got hundreds of thousands of installers, people that come install your boiler. We have about maybe 2,000 people that know something about heat pumps or low carbon heat. So there's a huge skills gap and potentially a huge unemployment. If all these gas boilers, there's now talk about phasing out gas boilers by 2025, this would create a huge unemployment because the retraining is absolutely abysmal here in the UK. I'm not sure if it's any better in the US. But what are we going to do with all these people or the insulation? That's another big, heating is about 25% of UK greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a big problem. Insulation as well. We don't have enough skilled people that will actually go in your jobs, the double glazing, the insulation under your roof. The same with car companies. Lots of skills, of course, with internal combustion engines. But if you are shifting to electric vehicles, that also requires fewer parts, so intrinsically fewer jobs, but also completely different skill sets. And I already mentioned the big industries as well. So yeah, I think this is going to be a big problem, and the government is it's still the idea, let's just do R&D, and that's enough. But R&D is only the first part. That's why I emphasize diffusion, to get things done. It's also about the skills, and we don't pay enough attention to the whole skills gap. So then to come to the capacity point, again, looking at the UK, the big problem is the government does not have sufficient capacity. They know about electricity. They've got good models to do that. It's quite simple to model in a way, but they don't really understand what's going on in the heating sector. They don't really understand the mobility sector very well. And what we see politically is that the big incumbent players, but the UK is called the Westminster model. So it's a closed kind of system, political system, where some of the big players have access, but everyone else is being sidelined. So although we could go to all kinds of transition pathways, we see that the technology is really being prioritized. So it's all about electric vehicles. That gets billions of subsidies. But we invest peanuts in car sharing or cycling or buses. We do a little bit, just enough to please the constituencies. So I think that the governance capacities are just, well, you might say they're not there. You may also say this is a political choice, that they decide to go in a certain way. And I increasingly keep coming back to the politics of these transitions. It is beginning to happen, but as I said, there are multiple transition pathways. And in the UK, at least, I see consistently that certain types of pathways are being privileged over others, which are those pathways that fit the incumbent interest because they are large-scale, big technology options. So yeah, I think the governance capacities well, maybe this is something that governments for 2 or 3 decades have learned how to optimize. Now, this was all about outsourcing and leave it to the market. To actually be more interventionist and shape markets is something alien to most policymakers. And I'm sure this is a big debate in the US as well, whether or not governments need to learn again, because they knew how to do it after the Second World War, quite interventionist, investing. They've lost those skills in the era of privatization, liberalization. You may argue they need to relearn some of the governance skills to actively shape markets, push innovations. But there's a big discourse against it. You know, the government cannot pick winners and all these kind of arguments.
Yeah, I think that's a I think utterly central point here. And as you know, Mariana Mazzucato has in her recent book on mission-driven change made the point it's not just the capacity isn't there in governments. It's that, as you've just said, we've come out of a period of multiple decades of hollowing out that capacity, of sending it off into the private sector, of subcontracting it, which means that there is no all of government capacity to do this kind of strategic, long-term planning, facilitation, so forth and so on. And so that is not obviously unique to S&T transitions. It's a capacity, it's a problem across governments generally that we have hollowed them out and need to recreate, as you've put it, capacity there. That said, if you go back to some of your early steamship work and so on, where did the capacity come from for that? What part of it was governmental? What part of it was private entrepreneurial? Are we getting too fixated on you need government capacity to make this happen, or what?
Well, my own take, and I've not studied this, but I've read a little bit about this, is that in the past, we had a lot more engineers that were actually quite close to policymaking. You know, engineers professionalized themselves in the 19th century, and they were quite closely involved in public infrastructure, sanitation, highways, all these kinds of things. My own take is that we now have too many economists in power. And they have a particular worldview. I've now worked with eco. They have a particular worldview. It's really also their science, you know, is full of highly abstract assumptions which just don't resonate with the real world. I think, and some people have studied this in countries that are, if you look at the positions of power, what is the background of these people? Are they trained in engineering or other kind of, you know, getting things done? Some of these studies show that we have a lot of people in power who are trained in economics or finance, you know, that, and they just have a different. So I think that's where partly where the skills gap also. And again, this is then almost about the politics of skills, and this is partly why, yeah, it's a different government challenge than it was, you know, in the Second World War, where we had to rebuild, you know, after the war. It's, yeah, there's a political economy of knowledge there as well. What is the training of these people in power?
Though at risk of causing heart failure and shock among some of my colleagues at the Kennedy School, I will defend the blanket comment about economists, simply in that indeed Mazzucato, Stiglitz, collection of economists have in fact been calling for exactly how you just phrased it now, is coming back, taking the political economy and capacity to do intentional broad scale promotion of social change and disruption. So I think it's to label the micro efficiency tradition that associates with some hunts of economics, not necessarily the entire overall macro perspective, where we've certainly had a modest share and a growing one of people emphasizing that. What I want to close with, though, is coming to your final phase of disruption, consolidation, and so on. And you've made, I think, a very warranted point about the influence of incumbents on inhibiting, slowing change, and so on. Let me ask you to turn that around and drawing on what your theory has to offer, but particularly your historical cases. What do we know about the rare cases in which incumbents intent on resisting change have nonetheless been defeated and undermined? Does that only happen when coal becomes too expensive, or are there strategies that have disenfranchised or disempowered incumbents that have worked not just in an ad hoc way, but systematically across cases?
Yeah, no, there is all literature now looking at destabilization and decline, and they do show, of course, the importance of costs. And if you are an existing technology or industry, you cannot compete, that's an important driver. But that literature also shows the importance of legitimacy and delegitimization. We did a case study of coal, which of course created huge fogs since the late 19th century. You know, a lot of air pollution, sometimes was so dense you could hardly look. But for decades, these fogs came and went, particularly if there was cold air and the smoke could not escape. But this was not a big issue. It was not seen as, well, it gradually built up a discourse of this discourse is filthy and dirty. And it was not just people complaining, but it was supported by the medical establishment, which increasingly gained power throughout the 20th century. But then it did also with the big fog accident, which was in 1952, right, which was in London, where it was closed for 5 days, I think, and 2,000 people died, you know, which at the time was a huge number. So delegitimization and the idea, which is partly about performance, but also about new visions, because by then right, you also had the gas actors who promoted deliberately in opposition to coal, gas as something clean and cozy and easy to do. So you had the dirty thing, and then so just to complain about the existing, when there are no alternatives, is not enough. You also need a positive vision that contrasts the bad qualities with walls.
And if we had another hour, that would lead us into the role of norms, which I know you've often also written about, but we don't. So for at least this pass, I'm going to close us off by thanking you, Frank, for, as I say, a tour de force of one of the most exciting emergent areas of work in the intersection of society, economy, politics, and so on, and a great kickoff to our operation here. To the audience, thank you all for your comments and questions. I remind you that next week we'll have Wake Smith talking about after net zero, so talk about the back end of Frank's process. We'll look in to see what happened. So thank you all. Have a good, safe day. Frank, have a good dinner, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.